We are in the midst of a series of messages that we started some months ago. Randy's already referred to it. We are in the book of Hebrews in the Old Testament, toward the back of your Old Testament. And we've been looking at these heroes of faith, these game changers that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. This morning, as we've gone through this list, we come to 4 different people that I'm grouping together because their stories are all found in the same Old Testament book. We're looking at the Judges, and we're going to be talking about the fact that there are unlikely heroes that come to the rescue. Sometimes the last person in the world you think would be able to be a hero or to be a rescuer is given a responsibility, and they have to work through their own obstacles to be able to do what they've been called to do. We're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, and then we're also going to be looking at some different passages, or at least at the stories in the passages in some different chapters in the book of Judges. And that's, again, that's in your Old Testament toward the front of your Bible. Now, in Hebrews 11, we're told in verse 1 that faith is the substance of things hoped for, or the confidence of things hoped for, and it is the assurance of what we do not see. And then the Hebrew author said, the person who wrote this book to the Hebrew Christians said, this is what our ancestors were commended for, the ancients. And he started by going in the book of Genesis and looking at all these different heroes of faith through the book of Genesis. And then he went to Moses. And then he talked about Joshua. And Joshua is where we left off last week. Think about this. Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt and out of bondage for 40 years. And then Moses died without going into the promised land. But his right-hand man, Joshua, was the one who was the leader of the army, and he was able to accomplish what Moses had brought them to the brink of doing. He was able to bring the Israelites back to their homeland. They were able to throw out the people that had squatted in that land. For the most part, they threw them out. And now they were resettling the land. And then Joshua passed away. What happened after that? This is the 11th in our series of game changers, and there is a verse in Judges chapter 17, verse 6, that tells us what happened after Joshua died. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. So after Joshua died, there was no real leadership for Israel. Though the priests were supposed to be guiding the nation, and they were supposed to guide these people always and forever toward God, corruption had set in. They had remembered some of the gods of the Egyptians from generations before. They didn't successfully throw out all these people, these pagan people, worshiping idolatrous gods. And so some of their influence and some of their forms of worship was sneaking into their lives and even into their worship. And as the Israelites went from bad to worse, their enemies oppressed them. And when they could take it no more, they would cry out to God. It's interesting, they would not cry out to God early on. They thought they could handle it. But it's only when they felt themselves going under and they felt like they were going to drown in their troubles that they cried out to God. And God sent rescuers. Those rescuers were called judges. They were able to help the Israelites from the time of Joshua's death up until the time that the first kings of Israel were appointed. They were called judges. But just as the people were imperfect, many of these judges were imperfect as well. And so let's take a look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32. There's a few other names in that verse that we're going to continue to look at as we go through the series in the next few Sundays. We're going to take one Sunday to talk about David and one Sunday to talk about Samuel. But there are 4 names before we see David and Samuel's names that we need to address this morning, and they're all found in the book of Judges. This is what the Hebrew writer said. He said, "What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you the stories of Gideon, Barak, Sampson, and Jephthah." And we're grouping those 4 together. He says, I've taken 31 verses to tell you about these their predecessors who were heroes of faith. But among those heroes of faith, here's 4 that I want to mention, and they're all judges. And let's talk just a little bit about what these guys did. First of all, Gideon defeated the Midianites. Barak defeated the Canaanites. Sampson defeated the Philistines. And Jephthah defeated the Ammonites. These were all those other tribal people who were still trying to take over the land of Israel. And these 4 men are mentioned only here in the New Testament. Their stories are in the Old Testament, and we're familiar with their stories. But it's only here in this one verse, anywhere in the New Testament, that their names are mentioned. Now that fact ought to make us pay attention to this. We also need to know that these 4 men had some very significant, very real character flaws. They weren't perfect. These 4 are just examples as to how God uses imperfect people to carry out his perfect will. And so let's start by looking at Gideon. Gideon! You've heard the stories of Gideon, the fleece before the Lord. Gideon with his army of 300 and how they conquered the people. I want you to know something. Gideon was a chicken. He was chicken. And his story is found in Judges 6 and 7. When we look at Gideon's life, we do not see a man of great faith, but we see a man of weak faith that God used in a great way. Can you remember that statement? God used a man of weak faith in a great way. Now, every year at harvest time, the Jews were losing everything they had to the Midianites. The Midianites would kind of let them go ahead and plant, and they'd let them cultivate, and they would let them harvest, and then when they were bringing in the harvest, that's when the Midianites would raid. They didn't have to do the work. They just came and took the crop, and took the bounty, and took the plenty. And with that happening, we find Gideon hiding. This is where the story starts. He is actually threshing wheat in a wine press. I'm sorry, but you don't thresh wheat in a wine press. Now, a wine press, these days, we think of something that would just maybe be some type of automated machine that would squeeze the grapes. In those days, it was often a stone curved situation or a ball or a circle that a millstone would be rolling upon the grapes and crushing them, and then the juice would flow out. But here's Gideon threshing his wheat, separating the wheat from the chaff in a wine press. Why didn't he do it out in the open field? Because if he did it in the open field, he would have been spotted, and everything he had worked so hard for would have been taken away from him. So for fear of the Midianites, he went to the last place he thought they would look for him to harvest his wheat, in the wine press. And it was there that an angel of God appeared to him. And the angel of God was very clear on this point. Gideon, you are the man to deliver God's people. And he repeated it a couple of different times in that chapter. And Gideon's response was, who, me? Yes, you. I'm sorry, you got the wrong guy. No, I don't. You're the man, Gideon. Well, Gideon heard this challenge coming from an angel of God himself. The people have cried out, the oppression of the Midianites is too harsh. You're the one that God is going to use to release that pressure and get the Midianites off the backs of the Israelites. Well, Gideon wasn't convinced that he was ever the right man to lead Israel. And so at that point, Gideon asked God to give him a sign, some type of unmistakable proof that God was really calling on him to lead Israel. And he even told God what the sign should be. Gideon put a fleece. He put the skin of a sheep out on the ground. And he asked God to make the fleece wet overnight and the ground dry. And in the morning, the ground was completely dry, but the fleece was soaked with dew. God answered it. But it wasn't good enough. Gideon said, we're going to do it a second time, God. And now tonight, I want the fleece to be bone dry, and I want the ground around it to be soaked with dew. And when Gideon got up the next morning, and he walked to where the fleece lay, his feet were soaking wet as he approached it. And he picked the fleece up, and it was dry. Now think about this. It was only then that Gideon finally believed that the Lord what the Lord had been telling him from the very beginning. I want you to understand that it's not really a sin for us to ask for a fleece. You ever hear someone say, I want to put a fleece out before the Lord? It comes from this story. But the difference here is that when we sometimes ask to put some type of fleece before the Lord to try to ascertain, try to determine what God wants us to do, the difference is quite often we don't know the answer. Gideon knew the answer. He knew it before he put the fleece out. God wanted him to be a rescuer. And Gideon was giving every excuse in the book. The guy just wasn't wanting to face up to what God was calling him to do. Now, I want you to know that it turns out that Gideon made a fine military leader. Once he got past his fear, once the chicken-heartedness left, 32,000 Israelites rallied with Gideon to be able to fight off the Midianites. 32,000, and Gideon thought, well, Lord, that's enough, isn't it? And God said, no, you need less. And so through a series of events, they were whittled down to simply 300. And 300 saved Israel. Gideon went forth by faith, and the Lord was faithful to his word. And when those 300 men blew their trumpets, the army of Midian fled in fear. It wasn't because of Gideon, and it wasn't because of the 300 when there could have been 32,000. It was because of the power of God. And here's the point about Gideon. As long as Gideon thought he could not do it, he was right. He could not do it. But once faith replaced his fear, Gideon won a mighty victory for the Lord. Gideon was an imperfect hero. He was chicken. But then we see the name of Barak. And Barak was milquetoast. Now, some people might know what the phrase milquetoast means. Others, it might be something that we're talking about for the first time, and you've never heard anyone talk about milquetoast. I would challenge you to take a nice, firm, crisp piece of toast, lay it in a bowl, and then pour milk over it and let it sit for a few minutes, and then try to pick up the toast and eat it. What's going to happen? It's just going to be sloppy. It's going to sag. There's not going to be any volume to it. It's not going to have the strength or the stability that it had before the milk was added. And calling someone milquetoast means that they are so timid that they cannot stand on their own 2 feet. They're weak. They're cowardly. Barak was as timid could be. We are told in Judges chapter 4 that he lacked courage and he would not do what God was calling him to do. The Canaanites were the ones that were attacking this time. And Barak was told to lead the army. And you know what Barak said? He says, I'm not going to do it unless you send a woman with me. That woman was Deborah, the judge. And he even said that to Deborah. He said that unless you go with me, I am not going to fight this battle. And so Deborah said in Judges 4:8, or this is what he said to her, if you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go. And in verse 9, Deborah replied. She said, very well, I will go with you, but because of the way you are going about this, because you are being so timid, the battle or the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman. Now, Sisera was the leader of the Canaanite army. Barak was going to be able to fight the battle, but he couldn't claim the capture of the leader of the enemy. Another woman would do that. And admittedly, the Canaanites were to be feared. They were some of the first people in the world that had ever accomplished the ability to create iron. To take iron and to make something that strong and that solid. And so they were able to fashion their chariots out of iron. Now, having a chariot of iron was a huge, huge benefit to them. It would be very much like an enemy army coming into your country with missiles and with tanks, and all you have are handguns. The odds were that lopsided. How could Israel stand up to an army coming at them with chariots of iron? Well, God was in the mix. And God sent such a fierce storm that the Kishon River Valley flooded. And when that river valley flooded, those chariots got stuck in the muck and they couldn't move. And what was going to turn into what was supposed to have been an easy battle for the Canaanites wound up being destruction to them. And Sisera, the leader of the Canaanite army, fled in fear. He ran to a Jewish woman whose name was Jael, and he begged her, "Please hide me, keep me safe." He had turned cowardly, and so she fed him, and she let him sleep in her tent, and then while he was sound asleep, she killed the leader of the Canaanites. And so even though Barak led the troops in battle, Deborah and Jael, the women, got the credit. Now, was Barak a bad guy? No. He was simply a good guy who was too timid. And in spite of his milquetoast demeanor, God used Barak with Deborah and Jael to accomplish great things. The third person mentioned there in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 is Sampson. And out of those four names, we know about Sampson, don't we? We know about the fact that he had defeated Philistines. We know about the fact that his girlfriend Delilah, who was a Philistine, had tricked him to reveal the secret of his strength. We know that when he was finally captured by the Philistines, his eyeballs were gouged out and he was made a slave. But we know that at the very end of his story, he had come back to God. And he had an opportunity, having been put on display as a trophy of the Philistines and of their conquering ways. His strength returned, and he was able to drop the pillars of the building they were in and kill 3,000 of the highest-ranking Philistines in the land. It's one of the most dramatic death scenes in all the Bible. It happened when a man was too full of himself. He thought of himself more highly than he ought. But there's much more to Samson. He was, I guess if you would compare Samson to someone here today, we would say he was the winner of American Idol. Everyone loved Samson. He looked good, he sounded good, he sang good, he smiled good, he was strong, and everyone loved Samson. But Samson, even when he had the blessing of God, still was throwing it all away. He was a bundle of contradictions. Samson was a man of faith with a weakness for women. Samson was a man of prayer who was given to uncontrollable fits of anger. Samson was a leader of Israel who lusted after the Philistine women. He was a man of God who lacked common sense. He was empowered by the Spirit, and yet he often lived in the flesh. Samson was just simply on opposite sides of all this. And when we read his story, we see that he was full of himself. But the real root of the problem in Samson's life was that he was never able to learn to be full of God and to allow his emotions to be controlled. They were loose, and Samson was a loose cannon. His whole life was one huge roller coaster ride. From the peak to the valley and around a steep corner, and then he did it all over again. Since Samson never learned to control his emotions, they controlled him. And his zigzag life shows us how people can connect to the Spirit of God, but not surrender to the Spirit of God. You see, Samson was deeply flawed, just like most of us. Samson found himself continually battling anger and the wrong desires, just like most of us. Samson could sometimes do amazing things for God, just like most of us. And then Samson could turn around and make incredibly stupid mistakes, just like most of us. And when I say just like most of us, I am really saying just like Tom Cash. Because I've been there. I've lived my mistakes. I've hurt myself, and I have hurt others. And I simply have been full of myself and not of God far too many times. In spite of Samson's vanity, and in spite of his lack of self-control, he began to deliver the people from the Philistines, just as the angel of God had said at his birth would happen. And Samson, with all of his problems, shows up in Hebrews 11 as a hero of our faith. Now, the last one is really interesting, Jephthah, because Jephthah was a fool. He was just a plain fool. His story is found for us in Judges chapter 11. We have one of the most unlikely examples of faith in all the Bible. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute. Now that sounds like he would have grown up without any guidance or direction from a loving father. Jephthah made what appears to be a very foolish vow. God had called him to do this work, to defeat these people, and Jephthah, in his rush to try to show his commitment, said, I am vowing at this point that after I come back from this successful battle, I will sacrifice the first thing to God that walks through my door. Now, they fought the battle, and he won, and everyone was celebrating. He went home, and he probably thought the first thing that would walk through his door would be a pet. Or maybe a chicken. But no. The first thing that walked through his door was his only child. His daughter. And she came running back to the house, and she was there to congratulate her father. She was there to celebrate with how God had done such mighty things through Jephthah and the army. And Jephthah said, oh, if it hadn't been you. But he felt compelled to do what he had promised to do. Now, the Bible tells us that the Spirit of the Lord was on Jephthah as he prepared to go into battle, but he made this mistake. And this mistake would haunt him forever. And this is the one thing we know about Jephthah. When that beautiful young lady came through the door and found out what Jephthah had promised, had vowed, she actually submitted to it. And she said, Father, give me some time. Let me be with my friends. Let me experience a little more of life, and then I will come to you. And for 2 months, his daughter spent time in the hills with her friends. And at the end of 2 months, we are told in Judges 11:39 that Jephthah did to her as he had vowed, and she died a virgin. Now, something's really screwy there. Something's really messed up. Jephthah actually offered his daughter as a burnt offering to the Lord. That was a heathen practice from the people that surrounded them. That was never God's intent. There is only one human sacrifice that counts, and that was Jesus Christ. No others count. And yet Jephthah, in his corkscrew way of looking at things, twisted way of looking at his faith, kind of combined the logic of the people around them who would kill their own in order to please their gods. These were depraved times that they lived in. And the situation was so low that Jephthah actually went through with this and killed his daughter. This is the hardest case of all. Here in this whole roll call of faith, all these heroes, here's a man who slaughters his daughter in the name of God. And yet we see that God can still use people in spite of their mistakes. That's the story of Gideon. That's the story of Barak. That's the story of Sampson. And that's the story of Jephthah. God can use us in spite of our mistakes. I read for you one verse at the very beginning of the message, and I want to wrap up the message with this same verse. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Now, when we say everyone did as he saw fit, we're saying that they did whatever they wanted. They had Moses, but he was gone. They had Joshua, but he was gone. They had the priests, but they seemed to not be very effective in their leadership. And so they did as they saw fit. Another way this is translated is they did what they wanted to do. And I will tell you today that looking at people's lives, there are folks who claim to be Christian but are living without their king. Right now, in 2016, in those days, there are some Christians who have no king and they just do what they want to do. That's not what we're about, folks. We're about looking at the imperfections and realizing that perfection comes because of Jesus Christ. We're not looking at heroes and lifting them up because they were perfect people in these Old Testament stories. We are looking at a perfect Lord who uses us in spite of our imperfections. These four all had real problems, but God used them anyway. Now, I want you to participate with me in this last part of the message. You're going to see some words in red come on the screen. When you see those words in red, I want us all to say them together. I want us to let this sink in. First of all, Gideon was chicken. He was afraid to answer God's call. Gideon was chicken, but God used him anyway. Barak was milquetoast. He was so timid, he needed someone else to be the brave one. Barak was milquetoast, but God used him anyway. Samson was full of himself. He couldn't control his emotions. Samson was so full of himself, but God used him anyway. And Jephthah was a fool. He spoke in haste. He was such a fool, but God used him anyway. And it comes down to this, folks. Either we believe in the redeeming grace of God or we don't. And if we do believe in the redeeming grace of God, we cannot be surprised that God uses flawed people like us, people like me, and people like you. And so I challenge you this morning, as I have for the last 11 Sundays, to be a game changer. To be a game changer. I hope this verse is going to be emblazoned on your brain by the time we're done with this. Without faith, it is what? Impossible. Do you believe that? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. It's all Him. And it's our surrender to Him. So the times that we've messed up, the times that we've blown it, the times we think I can't get back past this, realize God can use us in spite of our mistakes. Even after we give our lives to Him, He can turn around and use us when we've blown it. We have to trust the one who loves us forever. And we have to rely on His grace and His forgiveness that comes to us through Jesus Christ. He is the sacrifice. He is the human sacrifice, the one and only sacrifice that counts. And He surrendered His life so that we could have life. And we invite you to Him. If you need to make a decision to follow Jesus Christ, if you need to make a decision to be baptized into Him, if as a baptized believer you need to make a commitment to a church, if you're a Christian and you have blown it one too many times and you wonder, can I ever get back? You can come back. However God is leading you, you can come forward while we sing this song, a time of decision and commitment to let God be the rescuer of our lives, and then to be able to rescue others because of the power of Jesus Christ. Let Him change you and be a game changer for someone else. We invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing this song.